We might think of ghost hunts or investigations as a predominantly 20th and 21st century endeavour. Yet the legend of the ghosts at Willington Mill show that people were trying to unearth the supernatural even in the first half of the 19th century. Spectral figures and unearthly noises plagued those living at the miller's house, with witnesses even seeing the ghost from the street. Despite the fascinating tales of haunting reported by people who visited the house, it's the story of the midnight vigil that has become more famous. So let's explore the tale of the haunting of Willington Mill and try to sort some fact from fiction in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are into Supernatural Month because, yes, it is October, and that is kind of what we do at this time of year in these parts. And I was trying to decide what story to kick off with, and I remembered a story that I'd actually first come across when I was about 10, because it was first told in one of those lovely pamphlets that I often mention, Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria. And obviously I've had to go looking for a little bit more information because that was only 2 pages in this really small A5 stapled pamphlet thing, I suppose you'd call it. And I obviously ended up looking in the British newspaper archives, as I often do, and I was absolutely fascinated by the way that the story actually unfolds. As always, people sometimes ask why I'm including ghost stories with folklore, and I think it's because a lot of the time ghost stories become part of an area's folklore and they become stories that people share, therefore they are part of folklore as far as I'm concerned. So let's get on with the story, shall we? And to give you a little bit of background, Willington actually lies between Wallsend and North Shields, and it gives its name to the current area of Willington Quay. Now, the site we're looking at is ever so slightly further west, beside a narrow stream called Willington Gut, which empties into the River Tyne. At the point that we're looking at it, the site was home to a mill, the miller's house, and a collection of other buildings. And the steam mill was apparently 7 stories high and the northeast's first steam-powered mill. The miller's house was also surprisingly grand, boasting 12 or 13 rooms and attics across 3 stories, and it was built in 1806, although the hauntings took place between 1840 and 1845. Sometimes it's actually cited as later for 1847, but it's basically the 1840s. George Unthank originally owned the flour mill, but Quaker Joseph Proctor became a partner in the business in 1829, and Proctor and his family took up residence in the house. Now, it's important to note that the Unthanks reported no supernatural activity, but local rumours persisted that the house must be haunted. And when you read descriptions of it, it doesn't sound like it looks like it must have been haunted, so it's a little bit unclear where that particular assertion comes from. And it's also worth noting that the Proctors actually lived in the house for 12 years before anything weird happened. Now, rumours did abound of a murder during the original building work on the house, carried out by a builder, but that's pretty much as far as that particular line of inquiry seems to go. Now, a newspaper article in 2013 claimed that a local legend spoke of Kitty, a worker whose hair was caught in a millstone and died minutes later, and this legend apparently cites Kitty as the ghost haunting the mill, but it's the ghost haunting the house that are more often discussed. So what were these ghosts? Well, one of the ghosts was a bare-headed man in a surplice seen by 4 witnesses at the same time at an upper window. During this particular sighting, he was visible for 10 minutes and he drifted back and forward with his feet level with the bottom of the 2nd floor window. I don't know about you, but that makes me think that he was possibly walking on a floor at a different level because it was actually in a previous house on the site rather than the one in question. But that's just supposition. The witnesses described the figure as, and I quote, semi-transparent and as bright as a star, diffusing a radiance all around. As it grew more dim, it assumed a blue tinge and gradually faded away from the head downwards, end quote. Now, one of the witnesses, who was one of the foremen at the mill, tried to examine the scene from under the window and went to report the apparition to the family, but he found that the house was locked up for the night. The account also stressed a lack of moonlight to cause the phenomenon, so I really like the fact that even at the time they were trying to work out what could be causing the phenomenon. Is it actually just a normal, natural thing, or is it something a little bit more supernatural? Now, this phantom priest gained the nickname Old Geoffrey, so was he the person murdered by the builder during the house's construction? Or was the victim the woman in a lavender dress? Now, some reports describe her dress as grey, although let's be honest, a lot of the time lavender and grey are fairly interchangeable, and they particularly would be if you've got something as insubstantial as a ghost providing the colour. Now, this figure is most notable for her lack of eyeballs, and it seems that she stares at witnesses with empty sockets. People sometimes saw her sitting wearing a mantle with her hands in her lap and her head bowed. Now, it does seem that a clairvoyant visited the mill, although I can't work out at what point this happened. It was reported in the Shields Daily News in 1887, but it doesn't specify if it was in 1887 or if it was back in the 1840s when all this was going on. But either way, she described old Geoffrey and the Grey Lady, and according to her, the Grey Lady tried to confess a deadly crime committed on the site many years earlier, but the priest refused to hear her confession. So while this might explain the Grey Lady's continued presence in the area because she's unable to move on until she confesses, it doesn't quite explain why old Geoffrey's still there. People also reported hearing thumping against the floor, someone coughing or groaning in empty rooms, and small feet pattering around an upstairs room. Now, one rumour concerning Mr. Proctor claimed that he'd found an old book about a house on the site 2 centuries earlier, which also suffered the same haunting. Now, that is obviously very difficult to substantiate, but it does also negate the rumour of a murder during the construction of the present house. And I say present house meaning the one built in 1806, because why would a murder in 1806 affect a house on the site earlier? Unless you've got a time-travelling ghost, which would be very cool indeed. Now, we've got 2 different sets of hauntings to have a look at before we get to the vigil, and these fascinate me for so many reasons. And in the first one, 2 cousins of Joseph Proctor came to stay and they shared a bedroom. Now, on the first night of their stay, the bed rose up from the floor with the 2 women on it. Now, what fascinates me here is they raised the alarm, but they were fearing burglars rather than phantoms. So they were wondering if someone had been hiding under the bed and meant to sort of rush out and rob them. But a search of the house revealed nothing. On the second night, the bed was shaken again, and the curtains were opened and closed. And the descriptions of how that happened do vary, but it sounds a bit like someone was basically flapping the curtains up and down, but then there was nobody in the room to do that. On the third night, the women then decided to just remove the curtains altogether so that they could actually observe any happenings. And some of the reports do refer to them as being very brave, and I think in some cases they are. But there also seems to be quite a burning sense of curiosity with these 2. Now, they actually probably wished that they hadn't removed the curtains, because a female figure, described as being insubstantial as mist, actually drifted through the wall. Glowing with a blue hue, she floated above them, grinning down at them, before disappearing. Now, obviously, after that particular incident, unsurprisingly, Proctor shut up the room and no one slept in it again. But that wasn't the only one involving somebody coming to stay, because one of Mrs. Proctor's brothers, described as, and I quote, a person apparently most unlikely to be imposed on by fictitious alarms or tricks, end quote, seemed to endure not 1 but 2 bizarre events at the house. So in one of them, he just hears a lot of strange noises on one visit, and it's quite funny. He sort of resolves that he's going to say something next time. But then the second time, he finds that he can't actually say anything even if he wants to. And this is when he's staying the night. So he lay in bed and heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, but it sounded as though someone thumped on the banisters with a heavy stick while they were coming up the stairs, which obviously is unusual enough as it is. The sound came to his door, and when he tried to cry out, he found that he couldn't, so he actually sprang out of bed and threw open the door. Again, quite brave. Now, the landing was empty, but what was really bizarre was he could hear the same footsteps going down the stairs. There was the same heavy tread, the same banging on the banisters, but the stairs themselves were empty. So he could hear something, but he couldn't see it. He woke Mr. Proctor and they searched the house but found nothing that might have been causing the sounds. No one knew of any passengers under the house that might be the source of any noises. Quite a lot of accounts do also stress that the house is quite detached from the mill and any of the other buildings on the site. So you can also discount the possibility that the events had a logical explanation, like sound in another building somehow carrying through into the house. But I think for me, this quest to find the root cause of the haunting is what makes this entire legend stand out from other stories. The fact that the women decide they want to know what's going on, so they take the bed curtains down, where other people might be like, this is terrifying, I'm never sleeping in here again. They actually managed 3 nights in this haunted room. And then you've got this other fella who, while yes, he finds himself too scared to shout, he also then goes and opens the door to see what's going on. And I just think that that is a really unusual and slightly quirky fact in this particular story. But this leads us on to the wider investigation, because the stories of the hauntings spread, as these things often do, and caught the attention of Dr. Edward Drury, a surgeon. He'd read about the supernatural in the writings of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and Drury wrote to Proctor asking if he could mount a vigil in the house to get to the bottom of the events. Now, while Proctor warned Drury that this activity was sporadic at best, he agreed to some kind of investigation. Now, after a little bit of to-ing and fro-ing, the vigil took place on 3rd of July 1840, and Drury brought Thomas Hudson with him, a chemist from North Shields. They double-checked the whole house and, satisfied that it was shut up for the night, took up their post on the 3rd floor landing, facing the most haunted rooms. Only Drury, Hudson, Proctor and Proctor's servant were inside the house. I have no idea if they just simply mean the top floor, because the fact that it's a building of 3 floors, most people would call the top floor the 2nd floor, so I get a little bit confused whereabouts it is that they actually are in the house. But in a lot of ways, at this point, it's best to simply reproduce the letter that Drury wrote to Proctor, because he appraised him of everything that happened during the vigil, because it seems that while Proctor was on the premises at the time, Drury didn't actually speak to him in person before he left the building. And there's something about the way that people wrote in this particular point in time that I find absolutely fascinating. So this is the letter, and I quote, "Dear Sir, I hereby, according to promise in my last letter, forward you a true account of what I saw and heard at your house, in which I was led to pass the night from various rumours circulated by most respectable parties, particularly from an account by my esteemed friend Mr. Davison, whose name I mentioned to you in a former letter. Having received your sanction to visit your mysterious dwelling, I went on the 3rd of July, accompanied by a friend of mine, T. Hudson. This was not according to promise, nor in accordance with my first intent, as I wrote you I would come alone, but I felt gratified at your kindness in not alluding to the liberty I had taken, as it ultimately proved for the best. I must here mention that, not expecting you at home, I had in my pocket a brace of pistols, determining in my mind to let one of them drop before the miller, as if by accident, for fear I should presume to play tricks upon me, but after my interview with you I felt there was no occasion for weapons, and did not load them, after you had allowed us to inspect as minutely as we pleased every portion of the house. I sat down on the 3rd-storey landing, fully expecting to account for any noises that I might hear in a philosophical manner. This was about 11 o'clock p.m. About 10 minutes to 12 we both heard a noise, as if a number of people were pattering with their bare feet upon the floor, and yet no singular was the noise that I could not minutely determine from whence it proceeded. A few minutes afterwards we heard a noise, as if someone was knocking with his knuckles among our feet. This was followed by a hollow cough from the very room from which the apparition proceeded. The only noise after this was as if a person was rustling against the wall in coming upstairs. At 1:45 I told my friend that, feeling a little cold, I would like to go to bed, as we might hear the noise equally well there. He replied he would not go to bed till daylight. I took up a note which I had accidentally dropped and began to read it, after which I took up my watch to ascertain the time and found that it wanted 10 minutes to 1. In taking my eyes from the watch, they became riveted upon a closet door, which I distinctly saw open, and saw also the figure of a female attired in greyish garments, with the head inclining downwards, and one hand pressed upon the chest as if in pain, and the other, the right hand, extending towards the floor with the index finger pointing downwards. It advanced with an apparently cautious step across the floor towards me. Immediately as it approached my friend, who was slumbering, its right hand was extended towards him. I then rushed at it, giving, as Mr. Proctor states, a most awful yell, but instead of grasping it, I fell upon my friend, and I recollect not distinctly for nearly 3 hours afterwards. I have since learnt that I was carried downstairs in an agony of fear and terror. I hereby certify that the above account is strictly true and correct in every respect. Edward Drury." End quote. Now, Hudson later recalled Drury fainting in his arms, not just falling over him, but admitted that he personally saw nothing. It is, however, at this point worth noting that in Hudson's account, his governor in North Shields, a Mr. Ogilvy, asked him to accompany Dr. Drury on the vigil to, and I quote, "see that he doesn't come back with a cock and bull story about it," end quote. So Mr. Ogilvy doesn't sound like much of a fan of Dr. Drury. Now, while Hudson described many of the noises that they heard to normal causes, he did acknowledge a sound he couldn't explain at around about 12:45 a.m, the same time that Drury mentions it, and he said it sounded, and I quote, "as if someone were really there walking on his or her bare feet and approaching us, but nothing met our vision," end quote. As far as Hudson was concerned, he and Drury had a brief argument, having both been awake since 6 a.m. the previous day, so they were clearly a little bit fractious, and Hudson started to doze off. Moments later, Drury's yell roused him, and Hudson described how, and I quote, his hair was standing on end, the picture of horror, end quote. Drury fainted at this point, and Hudson then went on to investigate in the room where he heard the footsteps, but he found nothing. Hudson also noted that Proctor had entertained the pair with stories of the hauntings over supper before the vigil, so you do have to wonder at this point how much of what Drury thinks he saw was actually just like suggestion. But according to Hudson, Proctor had also never seen the ghost himself, although he had heard plenty of sounds he couldn't explain. His children had told him many tales of the apparition, but seemed remarkably calm about it all. And based on their testimony and the testimony of other witnesses, as well as his experiences of strange sounds, Proctor was quite convinced, and I quote, that the story of the supernatural appearance in his house was founded on fact, end quote. Now, the mill closed in 1865, although a chemical manure works bought the site in 1871. Proctor actually warned the new owner about the ghost, although no ghost was apparently forthcoming. Proctor turned the house into smaller tenements for workers, and some say the disturbances continued, albeit less often. Now, eventually the house succumbed to demolition, although I would love to know if the occupants of the rather posh new housing development on Miller's Bank have experienced anything strange. If you know anyone who lives there, please do let me know, because I'm fascinated to know if any of this has continued. Now, surprisingly, staff at Bryden Beckiert, I think that's how you pronounce it, who currently use the site, have reported strange activity. One employee reported being pushed in the back on a night shift, while a manager said he'd had the sensation of being watched and seeing shapes and shadows on the property. Now, we might account for this by separating supernatural activity in the mill and at the house, although frustratingly, because accounts refer to the mill, they don't always specify which part of the site they mean. So I don't know if the stuff that's happening in this current industrial facility are actually the ghosts from the mill rather than the ghosts from the house. Something that fascinates me about the case overall is the attempts at investigation made actually at the time, because you've got the foreman checking to see if anything rational had caused the appearance of old Jeffrey, you've got Dr. Drury's vigil, you've got the family members going in search of things. There seems to have been a really concerted effort to find a logical explanation for what was going on. And while Drury was driven by John Wesley's writings on the supernatural, many of the major players in the story seemed somewhat devout skeptics, which seems like a really contemporary way of looking at what was going on. Now, in many ways, this actually makes the story much more interesting, because no one really accepts what they experience as supernatural until they've exhausted other avenues. And nobody seems particularly scared by what's happening. So you've got like Proctor's children just calmly telling him about these ghosts wandering around the house, and nobody seems massively bothered. And I just thought that was quite interesting, the fact that whoever these figures were, they didn't really seem to engender any kind of fear, other than the sighting of the woman who terrified the two women into not sleeping in the bedroom. But there again, it sounds like that was probably actually quite a horrible apparition to see. But it does make you wonder, perhaps Willington Mill and the house really were haunted. And maybe the site still is. But what I want to know is, had you heard the story of the ghost of Willington Mill before? Do you live nearby? Have you got any additional things that you can add to this? Please do let me know. Like I say, I wanted to include this one because I'd known the legend for such a long time, and it was only when I looked into it that I was like, wow, these people were massively trying to debunk it in the 1840s. This is so cool. So that was why I felt I would include that one. And it's just a really unusual story in so many ways. It's a pity that the house and the mill aren't still there. But as I say, other things are on the site, so who knows, maybe these things do continue. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. We will be having a look at another supernatural case next week. Haven't quite decided what yet, but I am open to suggestions if anyone has any. For the final 2 episodes of October, what I would like to do is share your supernatural encounters. Obviously, there is a Google form that is open at the moment and taking reports of your encounters. These will not be debunked. These will just simply be shared as these are the experiences that people have had. As I say, I'm not going to be skeptical at anything about them. I just think it's really important for things like ghost stories or supernatural encounters more widely that they are just kind of preserved in some way. So, as I say, I am open to those kind of things. If you want to stay anonymous, you can. The form is below. There are a couple of questions to answer because it's quite helpful to know, like, where were you? When did this happen? Those kind of questions. And then just tell me what went on. And then, as I say, it would be really brilliant to share those for the last 2 episodes so that we can sort of do some folklore collection in action. and so on. The other thing is, if you are in Newcastle and I'm just going to check my calendar here because I'm currently looking at my September page, which is really helpful. But if you are in Newcastle on the 11th of October at 6 p.m, I am doing an in-person talk at Newcastle Castle about some of Newcastle's ghosts. So we'll be looking at spectral nuns, we've got phantom monks, we've got all the grey ladies, because there are several. We've got King Charles I wandering round. We've got, who else have we got? We've got Jack the Bad Beadle. We've got loads of different kind of stuff going on in Newcastle. Tons of stuff. So if you are in the area, it would be absolutely brilliant to see you. As I say, that is 6 p.m. at the castle. It's actually at the Black Gate, but you know what I mean. On the 11th of October, you're more than welcome. And I am also doing an online talk about some of the folklore and legends associated with cemeteries, both British and, well, there's one in Paris. And things like, what do burial markers mean? So what does an obelisk mean? What does a column broken in half mean? Things like that. And that is on the 14th of October at 6 p.m. with Cresswell Crag. So that one's online. So I've put the links to all of those things in the show notes if you are interested. But as this episode has gone on a little bit longer, because I have had these little announcements at the end, and it's also just there was a lot to go through for the story, I will let you go now. As always, if you want to buy me a coffee to say thank you for all of the research and whatnot that I do, you're more than welcome to do that. Or you can just leave me a really lovely review about how much you love the podcast, and that is much appreciated as well. But anyway, have an absolutely marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.